The day of the move-in carried a quiet anticipation, the kind that made the air feel both heavy and electrifying. The guest house stood at the edge of a winding lane, modest yet charming, its whitewashed walls catching the golden afternoon sunlight. Trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting playful shadows across the front steps. Carrying a suitcase that felt heavier than it should, there was a moment of hesitation. One small pause before stepping toward the door that would mark the beginning of a life she hadn't fully imagined yet. Opening the door, the first thing noticed was the faint scent of cedar and old books, a warmth that made the guest house feel lived in and strangely welcoming. Each room carried small, personal touches, a soft rug here, a framed photograph there, subtle hints of a life lived carefully, intentionally. The young woman ran her fingers across a polished countertop, taking in the quiet elegance of the space. It wasn't opulent, but it was thoughtful, meticulous, an extension of its owner, even before she had met him. And then he appeared. The man stepped out from the shadows of the living room, casual yet commanding in presence. His gaze met hers, a curious mixture of surprise and assessment, the kind that could make a person feel both seen and uncomfortably exposed. He offered a smile, small and enigmatic, and for a moment, the suitcase felt lighter, though the pulse in the chest quickened. There was something magnetic about him, a quiet charm that suggested there was more beneath the surface than polite greetings and small talk could reveal. As the initial pleasantries passed, she began to explore further, her eyes lingering on details. A collection of old books lined neatly on a shelf, a chessboard set mid-game, the way the sunlight caught the brass knobs on the drawers. Every detail seemed to tell a story about him, and without words, a connection began to form, a sense that this house, and now, her temporary home, was already entwined with someone else's life. She realized she was not just moving into a guest house. She was moving into a carefully curated world, a space that mirrored his mind, his habits, his presence. Time seemed to stretch in these first moments, the quiet of the house wrapping around her like a gentle weight. There was a thrill in the unknown, in the subtle undercurrent that she could feel but not yet name. Every glance his way, every small gesture, like the tilt of his head or the brief intensity in his eyes, hinted at a depth she hadn't expected. This was more than a simple move-in. It was the beginning of a delicate, intricate dance, where familiarity and curiosity collided in unexpected ways. By the end of the day, as the sun dipped lower behind the trees, she sat on the edge of the bed in her new room, suitcase unpacked but thoughts still tangled. She realized something quietly terrifying and exhilarating. This was not just a guest house. It was a space that had already claimed her attention, a world where she might end up living not just in a room, but in the mind of the man who owned it. The first real encounter lingered in the air like an electric charge. He stood by the doorway, relaxed yet deliberate, as if every movement had a purpose. There was an unspoken authority in the way he carried himself, not demanding attention, but quietly drawing it. Eyes met hers for the first time, not just looking, but assessing, curious, and something more complicated, something neither of them could yet name. A simple greeting, casual on the surface, felt heavier than ordinary words. It was the kind of introduction that left a mark, small but undeniable, like the first brush of a spark against dry tinder. As the conversation began, there was a rhythm neither had rehearsed. Words flowed naturally, yet every pause seemed loaded, every glance carrying subtle weight. He asked questions about her journey, about the move, and she responded. Every small gesture, the way his hand lingered on the railing for a fraction longer than necessary, the casual tilt of his head when he spoke, the faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips, hinted at a depth she hadn't expected. He was precise yet relaxed, reserved yet inviting, and she felt an odd mix of comfort and tension in his presence. There was a subtle playfulness, too, small teasing remarks, faint humor hidden in the way he spoke. Each word seemed to carry multiple layers, and she found herself reading into every inflection, every glance. It was intoxicating, the kind of energy that made a simple introduction feel like a meeting loaded with meaning. She caught herself wondering what he thought of her, what he noticed, how much of himself he revealed without even trying. The lines between casual familiarity and something more personal blurred in the space of minutes, leaving her with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. By the time the introduction ended, the day had shifted into a quiet evening. The sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows that danced across the walls and floor. There was a stillness now, punctuated only by the subtle sound of footsteps or a quiet exhale. She realized that meeting him had done more than introduce her to a person. It had introduced her to a world she hadn't anticipated. A world where she could feel the weight of someone else's attention, the intensity of someone's quiet observation, and the thrill of being noticed in ways that lingered long after the conversation ended. The first meeting left a lingering thought, unspoken yet persistent. Moving into this guest house wasn't just about the room. It was about stepping into a space that had already begun to entangle her thoughts, a place where she wasn't merely living among possessions and furniture, but under the gaze of someone whose mind she had yet to understand, and whose attention might be impossible to escape. The days settled into a rhythm, but each interaction carried a subtle undercurrent that made ordinary moments feel charged. The guest house no longer seemed just a place to stay. It had transformed into a space where every glance, every word, even every shared silence felt like an unspoken conversation. The man's presence was constant, quiet, but undeniable, like a gravity pulling her attention even when she tried to focus elsewhere. It began with small gestures, almost imperceptible at first. The way he adjusted a cushion when she sat, the faint smile that appeared when she entered a room, the subtle attentiveness in the way he listened to her, fully present. Each action seemed deliberate yet effortless, and she found herself analyzing them, reading layers into simple kindness. It was intoxicating, the way someone could make her feel noticed in every nuanced way, yet safe in the same moment. Shared spaces became arenas of unspoken tension. The kitchen, with sunlight streaming through the windows, saw casual conversations turn into moments where laughter lingered too long, and their eyes met with more than mere acknowledgement. Passing cups of coffee or utensils across the counter, their hands would brush ever so slightly, a spark igniting that neither could ignore. It was thrilling and disorienting, like stepping too close to fire and knowing it could either warm or burn. Even ordinary chores carried weight. Folding laundry, tidying the living room, watering the small indoor plants. Each activity was an opportunity for fleeting proximity, a moment for silent observation, or an exchanged smile that hinted at something more. The quiet intimacy of the house amplified the emotions between them, making simple, mundane moments feel extraordinary. She realized that she was not only inhabiting the space physically, but was becoming entangled in the emotional energy he carried with him, a presence so palpable it could shape the atmosphere of an entire room. The man's eyes often lingered longer than expected. Sometimes she would catch him watching her from across the room, subtle, almost imperceptible, but the intensity of his gaze left an imprint. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a careful, deliberate observation, like he was cataloging everything about her. And yet, it wasn't invasive. It felt almost protective, intimate, as if her presence had become a part of his internal world. Evenings brought a quiet reflection, when the house was still and shadows stretched across the floors. She would find herself thinking about the way he had smiled at her over morning coffee, or the way he paused mid-sentence, as if considering not just his words, but her reaction. She began to understand that the connection wasn't built on overt gestures or declarations. It was crafted in nuances, in tension, in moments of shared energy that neither could fully name. By the end of each day, a subtle truth became impossible to ignore. Living in the guest house was no longer just about physical space. She had entered a world shaped by his presence, his attention, and his subtle influence. Without realizing it, she was living inside his mind, where every action and glance had meaning, where boundaries blurred, and where a connection, fragile, dangerous, and magnetic, was quietly taking hold. The night settled softly over the guest house, wrapping the small building in a quiet hush. The house, usually alive with subtle movements and shared moments during the day, now held a different energy, a stillness that made every sound sharper, every shadow more intimate. It was in these quiet hours, when the world outside seemed to pause, that the true weight of the connection became undeniable. Sitting by the window with a cup of tea, eyes wandering to the faint glow of streetlights outside, the realization hit like a slow-burning spark. This wasn't just about living in a house. It was about inhabiting a space deeply influenced by someone else's presence, someone whose attention seemed to carve itself into the very air. Every glance, every smile, every subtle gesture from earlier in the day began to replay in her mind, like fragments of a carefully composed puzzle. The puzzle pieces formed an image she wasn't sure she wanted to fully see, yet couldn't resist piecing together. The man's presence had a quiet gravitational pull. Even when he wasn't in the room, his energy lingered, an invisible force shaping the way she moved, the way she thought, the way she existed within the guest house. His attentiveness, the small ways he observed and responded to her, had grown into a pattern she could no longer ignore. It wasn't just curiosity, it was an awareness, a focus that suggested he was seeing more than the surface, more than her physical presence. She felt it in the way he listened, in the way he spoke, and in the way the space seemed to breathe differently when he was near. That night, alone in the soft glow of lamplight, she felt a flutter of tension and fascination intertwine. The boundaries between day and night, between casual interaction and something more profound, blurred. Thoughts of him, of the subtle intensity in his gaze, of the almost imperceptible moments when his hand might have lingered too close, circulated endlessly. It was intoxicating and unnerving at the same time, a magnetic pull she couldn't resist, a thrill tempered by a quiet fear. Each memory of the day carried double weight in the stillness. The laughter shared over coffee, the brushing of hands in passing, the casual glances turned electric, all of it painted a portrait she couldn't escape. And with that realization came a deeper awareness. This was no ordinary attraction, no fleeting curiosity. It was something more deliberate, more consuming. A presence that occupied her thoughts as much as the rooms of the guest house now occupied her body. Leaning back against the windowsill, she closed her eyes briefly and let the quiet envelop her. It was both comforting and disquieting, a mix of warmth and tension that lingered like a whisper in the dark. She understood, with sudden clarity, that the house was no longer just a place to stay. She was living in the mind of someone whose attention could be as subtle as a glance, yet as consuming as fire. And that knowledge carried a thrill she wasn't yet ready to confront fully. Outside, the world carried on, unaware. Inside, the air pulsed with anticipation, leaving her suspended in a quiet moment of understanding. The boundaries had shifted, and the guest house was no longer merely a roof over her head. It was a landscape of tension, attraction, and unspoken possibilities that neither of them could fully control. The evening had grown quiet, the guest house bathed in the soft glow of lamps and the faint flicker of candles. The usual daytime warmth of conversation and shared laughter had given way to a more contemplative stillness, one that carried its own weight. It was in this hush that subtle confessions began to surface, small admissions, unspoken yet palpable, that neither could ignore. Sitting across from each other at the table, the quiet was both comforting and dangerous. The air between them hummed with the energy of unspoken thoughts, each aware of the other in ways words could barely contain. Every glance, every half-smile, seemed to carry a message. The intensity of those small gestures hinted at emotions neither had yet dared to voice outright, yet the acknowledgement of their presence created an intimacy that was impossible to ignore. The conversation was casual, almost mundane on the surface, but every sentence seemed loaded with meaning. A simple remark about the weather, a comment on a book or photograph in the room, became a channel for a deeper understanding. The man's tone, careful yet relaxed, suggested an awareness of the subtle tension, a silent acknowledgement that the dynamic between them had shifted. It was in the way he listened, not just to the words, but to the pauses, the laughter, the fleeting expressions, that revealed a depth of attention she could feel as much as see. Her own awareness of him had evolved. Each moment spent in his presence heightened the sense that the guest house was more than just a physical space. It was a shared landscape of thought and emotion. She noticed the little things, the way his eyes tracked her movements, the slight lean when he spoke, the almost imperceptible mirroring of gestures that indicated a closeness beyond the ordinary. Each subtle action reinforced the truth that living here meant becoming part of his world, and that world was as complex and magnetic as he was. As the night deepened, there came a pause, a quiet moment where words seemed insufficient. It was in that silence that the first tentative confessions emerged. Not direct admissions, but fleeting expressions of attention, interest, and intrigue. A lingering glance, a hand brushing near hers, a soft laugh that seemed to carry meaning beyond the immediate conversation. Each small act was a declaration, unspoken yet undeniable, revealing a connection that neither could fully articulate but both felt in their bones. The atmosphere became almost tangible, charged with anticipation and unacknowledged desire. Every interaction carried weight, every subtle shift in posture or expression hinting at the complexity of the emotions building between them. There was exhilaration in the recognition of mutual awareness, but also the faintest edge of fear of what these confessions, however subtle, might mean if allowed to grow. By the time the evening waned, the realization was clear. The guest house was no longer merely a place to stay. It was a stage for emotional entanglement, a quiet theater of attention, desire, and understanding. Living here meant inhabiting not just the rooms of the house, but the landscape of each other's thoughts. And in that intimate acknowledgement, both were acutely aware that what had begun as simple proximity had now evolved into a connection impossible to ignore, setting the stage for moments yet to come that would test boundaries and stir hearts in ways neither could have foreseen. The morning light spilled gently across the guest house, filtering through sheer curtains and casting soft golden patterns on the floor. It was a rare, quiet moment before the day's rhythm took hold. And for the first time, the space felt less like a neutral room and more like a shared stage for something unspoken. Across the kitchen table, laughter began to ripple between them, a sound both unexpected and intoxicating. It wasn't forced. It was natural, unguarded, and yet it carried a subtle tension that neither could fully name. The man made a small, teasing remark about her attempt at making coffee, something playful but pointed enough to make her cheeks warm. She laughed, the sound spilling into the room, and noticed how his eyes crinkled at the corners, a warmth and amusement reflected there that made the moment feel suspended in time. Every laugh, every subtle smile, carried weight, hinting at a growing closeness that went far beyond the casual familiarity of living under the same roof. Even mundane tasks took on a different energy. As they cleared the breakfast dishes, their hands brushed several times, and each touch lingered fractionally longer than expected. The sparks were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable, a tactile acknowledgement of the tension simmering between them. Words became less important. The glance of an eye, the curve of a smile, the smallest shift in posture spoke louder than sentences ever could. It was in these fleeting moments that the guest house transformed from a mere space into a web of quiet intimacy. Shared laughter carried a dangerous charm. It bridged the gap between curiosity and something far more magnetic, a pull neither could resist. She caught herself observing the way he moved, the rhythm of his gestures, and the nuances of expression that suggested an awareness of her in ways that went beyond mere attention. Each chuckle, each playful comment became a dialogue in itself, layered with subtle meanings and unspoken possibilities. It was both exhilarating and disorienting, a mixture of delight and caution coiled tightly in her chest. As the morning passed, the energy shifted from lighthearted to electric. There were moments where their eyes would meet and hold just slightly too long, moments where laughter would trail off into soft, loaded silences. Every shared joke, every gentle nudge or glance, carried a tension that neither could ignore, a reminder that the connection they were nurturing was no longer casual. It was intimate, charged, and undeniably present. By the time the sun climbed higher, illuminating the small corners of the guest house, it was clear that living here meant living within an evolving dynamic. The laughter was no longer just amusement. It was a bridge, a conduit for emotions neither had fully articulated. Each smile, each playful tease, drew them closer into a space where desire and curiosity intertwined, where boundaries blurred, and where the emotional tension that had been quietly building now simmered at the surface, ready to spark into something neither could predict. In those shared moments, it became impossible to deny the truth. The guest house was no longer just a place to stay. It had become a crucible for connection, desire, and unspoken understanding, a space where every laugh, every look, every small gesture carried meaning, and where the tension between them was only growing stronger with each passing day. The late afternoon sun cast long, warm shadows across the guest house, and with the dimming light, the quiet between them began to feel heavier, more electric. It was no longer casual. The subtle, playful energy of shared laughter had transformed into something sharper, more insistent. Every glance, every movement carried weight, as if the air itself had thickened around them. The proximity that once felt comforting now pulsed with a magnetic tension neither could deny. It began in small ways. A hand lingering a moment too long on a surface, a brush of fingers while passing an object, eyes locking for a fraction of a second longer than politeness would allow. The simplest interactions had acquired new meaning. Each gesture, each subtle smile, seemed to tease boundaries that both knew existed but were increasingly powerless to respect. She felt it, the pull toward him, an invisible force drawing her closer despite the quiet warnings echoing in her mind. Even conversation had changed. Words no longer carried just information. They were laden with double meanings, flirtations hidden beneath casual phrasing. A compliment about the guest house or the day's chores became an exploration of proximity, an opportunity to test limits. Every laugh and smile was heavier with significance. Every silence an invitation to read between lines that neither dared to speak aloud. The connection between them had grown beyond ordinary observation. It had evolved into a delicate, dangerous dance of awareness and anticipation. The man's presence was almost overwhelming in its quiet intensity. He had a way of being near without intrusion, commanding attention through subtle gestures and the deliberate calm of his demeanor. Watching him, she felt a mixture of admiration and tension, fascination at the effortless magnetism he exuded, and a nervous awareness of how much power his quiet attention held over her. Every moment spent in proximity became a negotiation between curiosity and caution, desire and restraint. By evening, the intensity of the day had settled into a charged stillness. Shadows lengthened, the sunlight faded, and the house seemed to hold its breath. They found themselves in shared silence, sitting close but not touching, each aware of the other's presence in a way that went beyond simple companionship. The air was taut, every small gesture amplified, the tilt of a head, the subtle shift in posture, the lingering gaze that refused to break. There was a thrill in the forbidden, in the awareness that the line between propriety and temptation had blurred, leaving them on the precipice of something neither fully understood but both desperately wanted to explore. In that quiet, heavy space, the truth was undeniable. The guest house was no longer just a physical dwelling. It was a landscape of emotion, a stage where desire, tension, and forbidden curiosity intertwined. Every glance and gesture had become a declaration, a silent acknowledgement of attraction that neither dared voice. And as the shadows deepened and the house held its intimate hush, one thought lingered in the mind like a whisper too loud to ignore. The tension between them was no longer something that could be ignored, and the next moment could change everything.